Thank you for that, Mike. Mike has already taken away all my first good lines. However, can I just see, Mike introduced me by saying that half of you wanted a job in Brussels and the other half might be sceptical about lobbying. Could I just see how that's reflected? How many of you are sceptical about lobbying at the outset? Okay, nearly everybody. Jolly good. Excellent. We'll talk about the tobacco thing later, perhaps. Do please ask me questions about the tobacco thing. I'll just introduce it by saying that 10 years ago, the company that I work for decided not to do tobacco. We do not have tobacco clients, and we have a global policy around the world now, at least for the last 2 years around the world, of not doing tobacco, of not working for the tobacco industry or for any of the organisations associated with tobacco. So we're in quite an interesting position to comment on the current problems with tobacco. And in fact, we work with the campaigns against tobacco to some extent. Yes. Is anybody twittering, by the way? Is any of this on the public record immediately? No. Okay, very good. It's always wise to ask these days whether anyone's tweeting, because you never know what you're going to see when you next look at your Twitter. Right, I'm going to look at, as well as what Mike said about the nature of democratic governance, which I hope is going to come out towards the end, I want to look at what is lobbying, what I call the transformation of lobbying over the last couple of decades, who is trusted, because I think this is very important to put lobbying, particularly corporate lobbying, into its context. I want to talk about transparency. I've already mentioned Twitter and the digital environment, but I think there are certain things about the social media, the digital environment and transparency which are very important, which have changed the world that people involved in lobbying need to think about lobbying. I want to look at, ask is transparency enough? And then there's a couple of conclusions to try and generate a few questions. First of all, I'll add a little bit about me. I run Burson Marsteller, which is Brussels' largest lobbying company. Burson Marsteller Brussels is part of a very large American public relations agency. Throughout the rest of the world, they tend to sell soap powder. In Brussels, we're a lobbying company. And there's about 70 people who work for Burson Marsteller in Brussels. I brought a colleague with me, Anna, who was a student here 5 years ago. Today tends to, I think it's the largest company in Brussels. I'm going to say a little bit about the other lobbying companies in a minute. And let's make a start. So what is lobbying? Sorry.
I don't mean to be rude, but it's really difficult to hear from here, so maybe...
Would it be better to use this one? Should I use... Is that better? Okay. Fine. Right. You've seen the headlines. Lobbying is controversial. It's very, very easy to find a controversial headline about lobbying. And a couple of days ago, in fact, I said to a colleague, give me 3 slides, a few headlines about lobbying, and this is what she came up with. It's very, very easy to demonstrate how this is probably the most controversial topic there is in European Union public affairs. Mike has already referred to the John Daly affair, or Dalygate, as it is now called. And almost every week there is a new story, a new scandal about lobbying. So I'm very, very aware about how controversial this all is. And in fact, hardly a week goes by without me making some speech or being asked to talk about or defend the world of lobbying. It's a highly contested, highly controversial area of work in Brussels. And it's, as I'll say a bit more about this in a minute, but the people who do the lobbying, who may not necessarily have a particular interest themselves, are also part of the lobbying story. And I'll come back to that idea in a minute. But what is lobbying? And this isn't quite what I say in answer to my mother when she asks me what I do. But I do think it's useful to start off with being able to answer the question, what is lobbying? And this is lobbying from the perspective of somebody who has been a lobbyist on every possible different side of the fence that it's possible to be on. I think lobbying is 5 things. The first part of what anybody in the world of lobbying does is what we would call monitoring. It is reading, it is watching, it is seeing everything that is happening on a particular area of policy that you are interested in. If you are the chemical industry, or if you are Greenpeace campaigning against chemicals, it's about watching every single act that the European Commission or any government or any European actor may be articulating or doing in the area of chemicals policy. If you're a car maker, it's the same for cars, etc. It's monitoring what's happening in the political environment. You can't do anything unless you know what is happening. Related to that, and the second thing on this nice continuum, is what I call intelligence gathering. And the difference between intelligence gathering and monitoring is that intelligence is going out there getting new information. Monitoring is usually relying on journalists and some other third party to provide information. Intelligence gathering is getting new information. It's contacting an official. It's watching a parliamentary debate oneself. It's scrutinising and investigating the actions of people yourself and getting new information which is privileged to you yourself. Monitoring and intelligence gathering are probably 75% of what anybody in the lobbying world does. And this is one of the great myths which I would like to explode right at the very beginning. Lobbying is not always, by any means, about getting people to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. The vast part of lobbying is about finding out what's happening and interpreting that action to the client. Another footnote right at the very beginning. I don't think there's a great deal of difference between working for a corporate client or working for an NGO. I think, generally speaking, it's the same. Unless I say otherwise, when I am talking about lobbying, I'm talking about lobbying in that sense, advocating and making the case for either an NGO or a corporate. And for me, the same applies, usually. I'll specify when it doesn't. So for both the corporate and the NGO, lobbying and advocacy starts off with finding out what's going on in the political environment through monitoring and intelligence gathering. The third thing on my nice continuum is policy, developing policy, which, to put in slightly different words, would mean what do you want the world to look like? What do you want to achieve? What is the outcome you want? How do you want the world to look if you are successful? You'd be amazed at the number of people that come through the door of Brussels' largest public affairs agency, Burson Marsteller, and say, we want to lobby. And I say, and what do you want to achieve? And they say, we want to lobby. It is absolutely incredible how people think that lobbying is an end in itself, even the client and the potential client. And usually this is the corporate. And when they mean lobby, when they say lobby, what they mean is they want to take their chief executive to meet some members of the European Parliament. And my first question is always, what do you want to achieve? And I think this is very important to be clear that the good lobbyist has to know what the end objective is. And the good public affairs specialist or the good lobbyist in an NGO will always have a very clear idea of what is the final objective, what is the legislative outcome that is sought, what is the policy outcome that is sought. And I think that's very important, because part of my role, a big part of the role of the lobbyist, is to work with the client or the organisation to develop this view of what the world should look like. So having done the monitoring, having done the intelligence gathering, having developed the policy, fourthly, one moves on to the strategy. And there are two different parts to this idea of strategy. The first dimension of strategy is the obvious one. Who are you going to talk to? What are you going to do? How are you going to implement the policy? What's the strategic moves that you would make to achieve a particular policy objective? Do you want a piece of legislation? Do you want the Commission to produce a communication on a particular problem? Is it about amending Article 5, Paragraph 6 of some existing piece of legislation? What is the strategy? There's a second dimension of strategy, though, which I do think is particularly important, which is if you're doing the monitoring perfectly and if you're doing the intelligence gathering perfectly, then you've got almost perfect information and knowledge about the political environment. And you might well be in a position whereby you could advise the client, the company you work for, the organisation you work for, You can advise them, in fact, not to lobby, but to change what they do. To get out of what they're doing, because you're never going to stop the world moving around. You're never going to achieve what you want to achieve. You might as well try and do something else. If you were advising ExxonMobil 20 years ago, surely the right thing to have done would have been to tell them to get out of oil into renewables. If you were advising a car company today, surely you would tell them, stop fighting CO2 legislation. You're going to have to bring down your CO2 emissions. That kind of advice is also the role of the public affairs professional, I think, to guide the organisation, to guide the client, to the point where they don't need to lobby. And I think this is, again, often it's one of those myths that this is not part of the role of the lobbyist, but for me it's very much part of the role of the lobbyist. Rather than just fighting what is happening, work with the organisation to adapt the organisation so they don't need to fight. So that's the monitoring, the intelligence, the policy and the strategy. And finally, if all else fails, it's about getting people to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. Lobbying, one-on-one advocacy, usually involving meeting with an official or a politician, asking them to table an amendment, to develop a particular policy, vote in a particular way, etc. The arrows on this very simple picture are relevant because for me they indicate the importance and the amount of time which is spent on each of these 5 things. And the actual lobbying, the advocacy, the face-to-face, getting somebody to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, is easily the least significant part of what any so-called lobbyist does. And I think this crosses the corporate NGO spectrum easily. Okay, today, however, I think lobbying has changed. I think lobbying is different now from 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, it was very easy. Lobbying was about what would today be called government relations, about working with policymakers, officials, politicians, members of the European Parliament, in my case in Brussels, to work on, in my case, in the Brussels case, European law. However, I think today there's a whole lot more than just that government relations. There's the development of a campaign strategy. There's media relations. There's advocacy advertising. Do any of you ever look at European Voice, the newspaper? Yeah, some of you are nodding. Look at European Voice. Almost every page there's an advocacy advert on it. Some of them are really good. Some of them have got 10 words and they get a message across instantly. Others are really useless because they've got 1,000 words. Nobody ever reads them and they're totally pointless. Developing a good advocacy advert is now part of the work of the lobbyist. And that whole world of advocacy advertising is much more important today than it used to be. Similarly, what is politely called here interest mobilization, i.e. finding allies. Like anyone who goes into battle, you're far more powerful if you increase the size of your fleet, if you increase the size of your alliance. So building allies, finding allies, building coalitions is part of the role of the lobbyist today, much more than it used to be in the past. The word digital appears here again. Using the digital media, using the power of the internet, the power of blogs, the power of Twitter, to influence the political environment is also part of what the lobbyist does. And interestingly, in a room full of people under the age of 30, I mean, it has to be said that younger people are far better at digital than older guys are, and older ladies are. So it's really quite interesting the extent to which there's a reverse mentoring taking place in many public affairs agencies, where younger people are guiding the older generation on how to use social media. So public affairs today, lobbying today, is about much more than what it's usually portrayed to be. However, so far so good, but now it gets a little bit more complicated. I think there's a whole lot of other things happening as well in the external political environment of the last 10 years, which have changed the nature, changed what is lobbying. Obviously, issues are globalised. We no longer live in a world where there are 200 little countries, if we ever did. But certainly here in Europe, the whole idea of a disconnected, fragmented Europe is over. Many issues now cross the globe. I mentioned car exhaust emissions a minute ago. If you look at American legislation, it basically has copied European law. And now European car makers are looking at China because China's next. The issue is a global issue, and law which is made in one part of the world finds itself reflected in another part of the world. The internet and communications, I've already mentioned, have exploded. Mike mentioned my time with Oxfam, and in fact, it wasn't as bad as you made out, Mike. But we'll come back to that in a minute. But one of the things that, many of you will not remember this because of your age, but in 2001, or in fact it started in the late 90s, the world's pharmaceutical companies, 37 of them, took the South African government to court because the South African government wanted to get medicines for 40 million people in sub-Saharan Africa with HIV/AIDS, and the world's drug companies wanted to charge a price which was completely stupid. And so the South African government tried to do something about this, and the drug companies reacted by taking them to court. The fascinating thing was that in the late 90s, it was possible for drug companies to do that without the entire world knowing about it, as it were. And it was during the court case, which lasted 3 or 4 years, that we went from a world in which drug companies could do something in sub-Saharan Africa and get away with it, to a world in which it was immediately on a television screen. And I distinctly remember in 2001, the headline in a British newspaper was "Beaten and Destroyed. Pharmaceutical industry withdraws from South African court case," because they lost the court case. But over the time of the period during which the court case was in progress, we went from an era of disconnected national media to global media. And one of the reasons why the pharmaceutical industry found that episode so difficult is because the whole world decided that they didn't deserve a good reputation. Not helped by the fact that the President of the Republic of South Africa at the time was Nelson Mandela, and in that position he was the person whose name appeared on the court papers as the defendant. Rather a stupid thing to do, to take Nelson Mandela to court. However, this explosion of the internet and communications certainly wasn't the case 10 to 15 years ago, but it is today. I asked at the beginning if anybody was tweeting. Perfectly easy for any of you in this room to communicate to the world as I talk about what I am saying. That's the new era in which we live. It's a very much more competitive and unpredictable policy environment. I think things are able to change very much more quickly than they used to. I mean, look at the little problems in the United Kingdom at the moment over the BBC. In the morning, Saturday morning, the Director General of the BBC gives an interview, and by 7 o'clock in the evening, he's resigned, he's gone. It's a very much more competitive and unpredictable policy environment than it used to be. NGO power, civil society, and the new social orthodoxy, I'm going to come back to later. But again, if I tell you one of my little Oxfam anecdotes, I'd spent 6 years as a pharmaceutical company trying to get the attention of the European Commission. I hadn't succeeded through the traditional instruments of lobbying. Within a week of joining an NGO, I got a phone call from the European Commission saying, "Oh, David, come and talk to us, will you?" It had taken me 6 years to try and get the phone call, but within a week of working for an NGO, I was invited to go and talk to the Commission as an NGO. Because there's a new orthodoxy, which is if you're a policymaker, you've got to talk to both sides. You can no longer be in the pocket of one side, whether it's DG Environment of the European Commission in the pocket of the NGO world, or DG Trade of the European Commission in the pocket of the corporate world. Both sides are relevant in the new social orthodoxy. And I think it's a good thing that the policymaker regards it as important that they speak to all sides of an argument. And I think that's much more the case today than it used to be. Transparency, I'm going to come back to. It's a very much more transparent world than it ever was previously. The end of ideology, I think, is also important in that in the era in which people like Mike and I grew up, politics counted. If you could identify people being on the left or on the right, you knew what people's politics were. Today, does it really make a difference? Are distributional politics over? Does it make a difference if you're in the Labour Party or if you're a Christian Democrat? It might make a difference if you're British versus Europe, but in terms of political families, does ideology count for as much as it used to count? I guess not many of you are in political parties, and I guess if I asked you, very many more people would put their hands up and say they were a member of an NGO than a member of a party. That's the world as it's developed today. Similarly, the speed of change I've mentioned. So all these issues about the political environment of the 21st century, I think change the nature of what the lobbyist does. And I think they change the nature of lobbying. And they make it different for what is the right and wrong of lobbying, coming back to the title and the word ethics. The rights and wrongs of lobbying have changed over the last decade or so. One of the things I've written about lobbying, I've tried to set out why lobbying in very simple terms in 3 words. So these are 3 simple words to express why would anyone lobby. 1, to transmit ideas. 2, to translate and simplify ideas. And 3, because timing is important. If you don't do the transmission and the translation at the right time, you're not going to be a very successful lobbyist. So 3 key ideas as to why lobby is to transmit information, to translate, and to get the timing right. And finally, on this theme of what is lobbying, simple definition, lobbying is to influence decision-making by legislators and officials. And it can be done by advocacy groups, constituents, other legislators, individuals, etc. Is there a problem? Is lobbying bad? Many of you were sceptical about lobbying and lobbyists at the beginning. There is a problem, and the problem of lobbying is when there is an asymmetry of influence. And this is what Paul Magnette said about lobbying a while ago, and he's right. Where there is an asymmetry, where groups have got more power than others, whether it's financial resources, brain power, or whatever, then there is a risk for democracy. And I think that's the key to answering the question, is there a problem about lobbying? The problem arises when you've got some interest which is predominantly more powerful than another. I'm going to argue that for most interests, that is no longer the case. As far as I see the world of lobbying in Brussels, more often than not, there's a relatively good balance between the different sides of an argument. And that's the argument I will make. I think where there is an asymmetry of power, as there used to be, tobacco industry versus tobacco control community, where that existed, then we'd have a problem. And we would need to do something about it. But I think generally speaking today, I would argue that there isn't really an asymmetry, and I'll say why. So, usually there's been an interest, or many times, historically, there's an interest in asking how many lobbyists are there in Brussels. And almost every book on lobbying, many books on the European institutions, in the chapter on lobbying and interest representation, you'll find a description of who lobbies in Brussels. And you often find the figure 15,000 or 20,000. And many of you will have seen Justin Greenwood's work, and he usually starts with counting how many lobbyists there are in Brussels. I think more interestingly than how many is what are the different kinds of lobby. There's the trade associations, the European Federation of the Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, the CIAA, which is now called, it's just changed its name to Food Europe, which is the food companies. Europa Bio, the biotech companies. Cefic, the chemical industry. You can go on and on with acronyms, but 700 is a conservative estimate of the kind of trade associations that you find in Brussels. One of the interesting things about the trade association world is about how they have changed over the last 2 decades. They used to be almost overwhelmingly federations of federations. So take the pharmaceutical industry one for a start. It would be the European Federation of the Pharmaceutical Industry, but its members would be national trade associations. So the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, the French Pharmaceutical Industry, the German Association. They would be the members that came together in the European Federation. These days, and this is across the board, this doesn't happen hardly at all these days. These days, the corporate sector has taken control, the companies have taken control of the Brussels Trade Association. Almost every trade association today in Brussels has corporate members directly as members. This is relatively new, and it indicates the significance and the importance and the power of the European project. In the past, big multinational companies would quite happily leave it to a federation of federations to manage their affairs in the European institutions. Today, those companies, those organisations, very rarely leave it to a federation of federations. They want to have direct membership and direct influence via the trade association in Brussels. And related to that, alongside their trade association, they're going to have their own Brussels office as well. So on the screen, I've mentioned FPA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry and Associations. I'd find it very difficult to name a pharmaceutical company that has not got a Brussels office in addition. And many of them have got 10, 15 lobbyists working in the Brussels office alongside their trade association. So there's the trade associations, there's companies, then there's the consultancies. I'll come back to those in a minute, but the agencies such as Burson Marsteller, Hill & Knowlton, Weber Shandwick. Then there's the regions, the German land, the English and British regions, and their offices in Brussels. There's an enormous new office block being built next to my office in Brussels, a 6-floor building, which I am told is a single German land. One of the largest buildings next to the European Parliament is the land of Bavaria, and people refer to the Bavarian embassy. So the regional offices are an important part of the lobbying world of Brussels. And then, of course, there are the permanent representations. Now, of course, many of you here will probably disagree with me, but a very important part of the lobbying world in Brussels is the member states themselves, who are lobbying the other institutions from the one of which they are most directly a member. Permanent representations of the member states, for example, all of them employ parliamentary officers, teams of parliamentary people these days, whose role it is to influence the European Parliament. What they do is absolutely no different from what I do on behalf of corporates or other interests. So I would certainly see member state permanent representations as part of the lobbying field. Third countries, of course. The US mission is a powerful lobbyist. The Canadian mission is a powerful lobbyist. The African, Caribbean, Pacific Secretariat, etc. I don't know if any of you know anything about Canadian politics, but if there's a big issue, it's tar sands. It's about the rape of Alberta in Canada to extract oil from the sand. A big issue in Brussels and being heavily lobbied by the Canadian government. Similarly, almost any trade issue, you will find the footprint of the American government in Brussels. And then, of course, there's the NGOs, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, WWF, Oxfam International, ActionAid, Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPCA, you name it. Again, in terms of acronyms, there's as many NGOs active lobbying in Brussels as there are anybody else. And, of course, the trade unions. ETUC, GMB, British Trade Union, has an office in Brussels, IG Metall for Germany, etc. So not only is it about how many, but I think it's also useful and good to look at this variety. There is an enormous variety of who comprises the lobbying world in Brussels. And this is exactly what you would find in any national capital, but writ large. The same kind of vibrant political policy community now exists in Brussels that you would find in London, Berlin or Paris. You also find the church. This is a really interesting one. This is an example from this week. This is the liberal Catholics lobbying against a radical Catholic. This is the briefing for Catholics for Choice against Borges, which is a really interesting example, distributed to members of the European Parliament's Environment Committee and other committees that for the hearing of the replacement of Daly this week. So don't forget the religious ideologues as well. Moving on to the public affairs agencies. This is my little thumbnail sketch of the big ones and the little ones. More interesting is the next picture. This shows their revenue. We now live in an era of transparency. There's no longer, there's less secrets than there used to be, even about how much these companies get from clients. You can go to the European Commission's Transparency Register page and you can compare the revenue declared to the European Commission and European Parliament Joint Transparency Register for the lobbying agencies of Brussels. Now, I don't mind showing this picture because if I can do it, the accountability campaigners that lobby against the public affairs world, they can also do it. But it's quite interesting how you've got two big Brussels agencies, Burson Marsteller and Fleischmann Hillard, and a whole lot of smaller ones. And I tend to think that the second one on this graph will be a little bit down next year, because one of the characteristics of the lobbying world is that anyone can be a lobbyist, and anyone can leave a lobbying company at any time, set up their own company and take clients with them. And this is exactly what's happened in the case of Fleischmann Hillard. One of their senior people left about 6 months ago, took 3 or 4 people with him, and took about 15% of the business of Fleischmann Hillard, we estimate. So one of the interesting things about this lobbying world is that in today's world, and I'll come back to this in a minute, anyone can be a lobbyist. And so if you run a public affairs agency like I do, you've got to think not only about numbers, but also about the people. And if the people aren't happy, they can very easily go somewhere else. And it's something which I think is often forgotten. So that's my thumbnail sketch of the revenue of the public affairs companies. In a company like Burson Marsteller or Fleischmann Hillard, you're talking about between 10 and 12 million a year revenue, and probably a third of that is profit. Let me now come back to this idea of political conflict in the 21st century. I think in the 21st century there's a new kind of battle. Politics used to be, until the 1990s, politics used to be about labour versus capital. It was a very simple 19th century conflict. I think it's been replaced. I think it's been replaced by an NGO versus corporate battle on many, many different issues. Even in a time of austerity, I think the same applies to a great extent. If you look at many of the issues that are dealt with in the European institutions, and I think this is even more so in Brussels than it is in national capitals, but if you look at the kind of issues that are dealt with in the European Union regulatory state, it's about usually the ownership of ideas rather than the ownership of the means of production. It's about patents, intellectual property rights on biotechnology, on medicines, on software. It's about the regulation of trapping standards, the protection of animals. It's about the animal testing of cosmetics. Those kind of issues are very much the stuff of the Brussels policy world, much more so than the traditional battle of labour versus capital. So in this regulatory state, the battlefield, the EU is the battlefield for a confrontation between corporates and organised civil society. And you see this everywhere. Funnily enough, it's also a battlefield for the battle between corporates. And I'll come back to in a minute a particular little incident, which puts Google against Facebook, for example. Now, there's one, in fact, in a minute I was going to talk about a nuclear war, but look at the battle between Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook. You know, that is a major corporate battle. Is it any surprise that Google has got 20-odd people in Brussels? And Microsoft has got one of the biggest offices as well. They're using the European Union regulatory state against each other. So there's a corporate battle as well as a corporate NGO battle. This is one from this week. This is the Friends of the Earth et al. Friends of the Earth, Oxfam, various NGOs campaigning against, in fact, interestingly, campaigning on a subject currently in trialogue, trying to get a first reading agreement on the transparency of payments made by extractive industries in developing countries. So when mining companies bribe foreign governments in developing countries, what standards of transparency are required of them. And this is lobbying by these NGOs. In fact, this is a half-page advert in the Financial Times. So just think about the kind of money you need to do that kind of ad. But this is what even NGOs are doing today in the lobbying world of Brussels. Okay. One of the problems of the corporate versus NGO conflict, which I find particularly interesting, is you've got to think about what is the issue, what is the problem, very much more than you had to before. In the era of traditional politics of trade unions versus capital, life was easy. You know, you were employed or you were an employer. You were in a trade union or you were a business interest. In today's world, you've got to think, what is the problem? A little bit more than you used to in the past. One of the issues that I spent a lot of energy on 10 years ago is the subject of the patenting of genes. So if there's for example, I'll use a women's issue example. There's a couple of genes called BRCA1 and BRCA2, which signal a likelihood of breast cancer. If you own those genes, then you can monopolize access to research and medicine about them. Clearly, there's a major ethical problem in that. The ownership and the possibility of patenting those genes is highly controversial. If you are the pharmaceutical industry, though, that issue is about those words on the screen. It's about innovation. It's about science. It's about employing people in R&D. It's about the genomics revolution in healthcare, in an American accent. It's about shareholder value. That's how they see it. However, just think yourselves about, what about this idea of owning genes, your genetic information? What does that say to you? Well, sorry. Okay, there we go. For a lot of people, for the critics, a whole different set of words come to your mind. And the words that come up are about cloning, privacy, patenting life, privatising healthcare, embryo research, animal welfare, religion, pro-life, abortion, biopiracy, xenotransplantation, putting pigs' livers into the human body, embryonic stem cells. Those are the kind of words that you would associate, more likely than not, with the idea of patenting genetic information. So this idea of what is the issue is much more of a problem today than it used to be. Because if you're the pharmaceutical industry and you want to go lobbying or you want to influence public policy on gene patenting and intellectual property rights for genetic information, pointless talking about innovation, science, employment, shareholder value. That's not the problem. The problem is the things on the right-hand side of the screen, and they're very, very much more difficult to address than these good old ideas of an earlier kind of politics. You've got to talk about ethics. And related to that, of course, please don't ever let anyone tell you the European Union doesn't do ethics, because this is another good example of a different problem. That if you do intellectual property rights, clearly you've got to start thinking about the ethics of it, particularly in this area of biomedicine. So I think in this new era of politics, framing the issue is a problem. Similarly, look at this, you know. This is a picture that was in a newspaper attacking the pharmaceutical industry, attacking the biotechnology sector. These are plastic mannequins with barcodes on their arm. It's a very powerful symbol, you know, no patents on life. Is that about science or is it about ethics? Clearly, it's about ethics in policy. And it's no use using the traditional arguments of, in this case, the pharmaceutical industry. You've got to talk ethics to people that are worried about it. Similarly, another well-known example, which we can talk about later perhaps, animal testing of cosmetics. And it's a great example where the European Parliament has set the agenda. 20 years ago, the European Parliament started the battle to ban animal testing of cosmetics. And in 1993, the majority in the European Parliament was 327 to 6. A pretty powerful majority. Amazingly, this issue is still being fought about in Brussels. Amazingly, the cosmetics industry is still fighting for the right to blind rabbits or other animals. It's exactly the same battle today, and it's the same parliamentary majority. Now, if you're the lobbyist, what do? I think it's very important as the lobbyist to say to the cosmetics industry, you're not going to win in a vote where the European Parliament has got power on this. Highly unlikely that you're going to get the European Parliament to change its position. I could not win a battle in the European Parliament on animal testing of cosmetics, I don't think. I think it'd be extremely difficult. Except insofar as there's one little idea that might be helpful if you were advising the cosmetics industry. The vast majority of animals used by the cosmetics industry are rats. And very few people will defend rats, I think. However, the point still stands that in an era where the European Parliament has got very much more power than it used to have, trying to win a parliamentary majority on that kind of an issue would be extremely difficult. Related to that, I think trust is important, as I said at the beginning. Who you trust is something that if you're in politics, you instinctively think to yourself, who trusts me? What is the trust barometer, as this thing is called? And one of the interesting things is that if you ask that question, NGOs, the non-governmental organisation, the public interest organisation, let's call it, easily comes out on top. The NGO is always going to be more trusted than business. And the NGOs and business are more trusted than government, interestingly. So if you ask the question, in Europe, who do you trust? And you give the options on the screen, from Amnesty through WWF down to Monsanto. That's the kind of picture you get. Amnesty, WWF, Greenpeace are easily more trusted than these major corporate players. Now, this graph is actually a little bit old, but you would get exactly the same picture today. You get a slightly different picture in the US, slightly different. But WWF and Amnesty is still high. Do we have any Americans, by the way? Are there any Americans in the audience? No Americans. Good, excellent. You get a slightly different picture in the US, but still, the public interest organisation still rates higher than Shell, Monsanto, Exxon, Deutsche Bank, etc. Interestingly, of course, bear in mind that trust in the European Union is also at its lowest level ever, though still slightly higher than trust in national governments and national parliaments. Final little idea on this part of what I wanted to say before coming to the final subject. Agencies such as Burson Marsteller are also part of the messaging of conflict, as I call it. We haven't got all the words on the slide. In this new political world, this new era of confrontation between corporates and NGOs, the professional advisors of the corporates, and possibly the advisors of the NGO world, but very much more the professional advisors of the corporate sector, immediately become part of the battle, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. So here's another example from this week or last week. Corporate Europe Observatory, which is an accountability campaigning organisation which hates Burson Marsteller, hates me and people who work for Burson Marsteller. They produced a report on shale gas lobbying in Europe. I don't know if you're familiar with shale gas, but it's about injecting chemicals into the Earth's crust, and the chemicals eject the oil, and then you harvest the oil and you tanker it out of the area. If any of you ever go to the southeast of France, in every little village in the southeast of France, you will see signs saying "Non à la gaz de schiste." Everywhere. The signs are everywhere. Similarly, if you go to any little village in Poland, you will find exactly the opposite sign. We want shale gas to give us independence from the Russians. So Europe is divided over this new source of energy independence. And the Corporate Europe Observatory publication is addressing who is lobbying on it. And just to read from the little sentence here, lobby firms such as Burson Marsteller and Fleischmann Hillard are hired by the oil and gas industry to provide guidance through the European legislative jungle. First point, Burson Marsteller does not have a shale gas client. And if you read the sentence again, you will see it's actually truthful, in that it doesn't say we work on shale gas. It says that we're hired by the oil and gas industry to provide guidance. So they've correctly identified that we might have clients in that sector, but we don't work on shale gas. And then it gets even more interesting in the next sentence. These two firms alone maintain an army of more than 100 lobbyists, shock horror, equipped with access badges for the European Parliament. Well, of course, in today's transparent era, companies like that put the names of their employees on the Joint Transparency Register website, which has been created partly due to organisations like Corporate Europe Observatory. We put the names there to be transparent, and the names are all listed, and now they've become an army of more than 100. So it's interesting how the professional advisor, the agency, which clearly I don't have an interest in shale gas, except insofar as I don't like the idea of it, under my house, frankly. I don't have an interest in shale gas. The client might. But what's interesting is the extent to which the agency, the professional advisor, becomes part of the political conflict. And that's something which I think the lobbyist of today has to be aware of. If you're the professional advisor, the professional lobbyist, you may yourself become part of the problem simply through giving professional advice. You become part of the story, which is not really the place you want to be. So, let me come on to transparency now. I've said a little bit about the Transparency Register. This is what the Transparency Register looks like, eceuropa.eu/transparency register. You can go to almost any agency in Brussels. I think there's probably 4,000 or 5,000 different interests now on the register. It's a very good source of information. It's important. It should be supported. Burson Marsteller welcomes it. Most large agencies welcome it because it helps remove some of the mystique, some of the myths, some of the ambiguity about what is professional public affairs and lobbying. There is an interinstitutional agreement establishing the Transparency Register now and ensuring that it is a joint register between Commission and Parliament and hopefully one day Council. And there is an associated code of conduct which is policed under the register. So anybody who accesses, for example, the European Parliament under the conditions of the register has to comply with the code of conduct, and if they break the rules, then in principle their organisation can be removed from the register. There's also a complaints procedure associated with it. And similarly, this is a bit of the Burson Marsteller extract from the register. You can identify who the clients are. And not only that, you can also identify today the financial bracket within which they are in. Clients generating turnover of 150 to 200,000, clients generating turnover of 200 to 250,000, etc., etc. This is extremely transparent. And I think the vast majority of people in the lobbying world welcome it. There are still some dinosaurs, but generally speaking, it's welcomed. And certainly the company I work for would support it being compulsory. At the moment, it's voluntary, but effectively, if you're not on it, you're very quickly going to be... well, it started to happen whereby if you ask for a meeting with a member of the European Parliament or Commission officials, they've started asking the question, are you on the register? And that's a good thing. Because it helps get rid of the cowboys. It helps get rid of the people that try to bribe Dali, for example. And an interesting part of the Dali story is that, of course, the person who did the or tried to do the bribing was not on the register. And there's no information about him, except on the pages of the Malta Times. And interestingly, the Malta Times are having more readers these days than ever before. In Burson Marsteller, we've gone one step further. And everybody who works for my organisation, as a part of their contract of employment, has an annex to it which says that all emails, letters, faxes, etc. on behalf of clients will be followed by the words consultant to XXX, whatever the client is, along with their website address. It's very important to make the point that whatever the lobbyist does in a company like Burson Marsteller is done on behalf of somebody. And that somebody should be identified. That's transparency. One should no longer live in this era whereby you hide who the client is. But I'm still amazed by how often you see emails and correspondence where it's not clear who the lobbyist is lobbying on behalf of. So we've gone this step further in Burson Marsteller. Every consultant is required to do this. I'm not so sure we'd ever fire anybody for not doing it, but it's certainly part of their contract, and when they sign their contract, they sign this as well, that they will always clearly and transparently identify who is their client. There's always grey areas. When you go to a meeting and you ask a question in a conference, and you're there not on behalf of a particular single client, how do you handle it? And it's one of the questions which is often asked to me usually, you know, David, what I'm going to this conference, if I want to ask a question, who do I say I'm going on behalf of? So there are there's always grey areas, but the idea of transparency is absolutely important. Social media is a particular problem. Have I got another 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Ooh.
Yes.
Okay. So, social media is a fascinating area of difficulty, where transparency is even more important, and this commitment to transparency and the idea of being transparent and also not being nervous about being open. It's fascinating when you get into this transparency subject and people instinctively say, oh, I don't want to divulge that. Do I have to say all of that? Once you get over that initial fear of being transparent, it's so it frees you once you get over the initial fear, and it's particularly important in the world of social media. So I mentioned Facebook and Google earlier. This is my nuclear war story of how Burson Marsteller got itself in the middle of a nuclear war, and it's a really good little story. And it doesn't involve Brussels, and it doesn't involve the European Union, but it does involve the front page of the Financial Times, which is just about as bad as it can get. And it started when a Burson Marsteller employee in San Francisco rang a blogger and said, would you like to run a story on how bad Google's privacy policy is? And not only did he ring him, but he then sent an email. Let me just find the email. I've got it here somewhere. Sorry. Here's the email. This guy sent the email. Thanks for the prompt reply. I'm afraid I can't disclose my client yet, but all the information included in the email is publicly available. Any interest, you journalist, in pursuing this? And then he said further down, well, in reply, the blogger, the digital journalist, asked the Burson Marsteller guy, who's paying for this? not paying me, but paying you. Who's your client? And the Burson Marsteller guy said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that yet. Now, I actually think this is the kind of conversation that 10 years ago would have happened all the time, constantly, between any PR firm and any journalist, or any PR firm today and any blogger. It's the typical kind of story that would have always happened. The role of the PR firm 10 years ago was to make exactly this kind of call. Ring people up, try and get a story reported in a newspaper, or today try and get a story on a blog site, by a blogger. And in this particular case, the client of Burson Marsteller was was Facebook, and the target was Google. So what you got was eventually these kind of headlines. Facebook admits its PR firm briefed against Google. Facebook in PR plot against Google. Facebook is behind an anti-Google campaign. You get it in all languages, all over, everywhere. From the BBC to the Financial Times to Libération to El País, etc. Everywhere. And in fact, what's also interesting is the speed at which this happened. The telephone call I referred to a minute ago occurred on the 3rd of May. By the 13th of May, it was on the front page of the Financial Times. And again, think interconnected world. Think San Francisco. You know, little guy working for a PR firm in San Francisco made a phone call. Given the power of the web, given the power of the web to drive the traditional media, it created a major crisis within the PR firm concerned, and a major investigation as to who said what, when to who, etc. And it became a big issue. The only good news is that you'll remember this when I say it. It happened at exactly the same weekend that Dominic Strauss-Kahn found himself in a hotel room in New York. And so the only good news is that it very quickly got knocked off the front page. And it was very interesting to compare our little blip with the DSK mountain of news coverage. That was the only good news. But I would say, in observation of that this was actually, I think, a good old-fashioned screw-up caused by a lack of transparency vis-a-vis mainstream media, which was merely shared via other media, including social media. We Burson Marsteller, became really obsessed with it because it involved social media. But the social media element was not actually a major part of the issue. It was about not being transparent. What social media does is it telescopes, magnifies that lack of transparency. And it makes any lack of transparency potentially a global story. And that's the really important thing, the really important learning from this episode, is that if you make a mistake, you can have global effects. You can cause news media to be influenced around the world, as this particular case demonstrated. With over a 10-day period, there was an endless amount of media coverage until it got itself on the front page of the Financial Times, and that was the final straw, basically. And then, of course, the question, then within the company concerned, you then get the discussion about, do you fire the perpetrator? And in fact, Burson Marsteller said that they would retrain them, which was amusing. It was a fascinating saga, but it does demonstrate the very great impact of the new digital communications. That if you get something wrong in one little part of the world, you can immediately have a big impact somewhere else. So there are 6 fundamental lessons from that. 100% transparency in all dealing is massively important with clients and with the outside world. If you make a mistake, you've got to say sorry very quickly. You don't blame others for what someone does. You don't try and censor public criticism because you're going to get criticised, so you just got to sit back and accept it and say sorry. Remember to communicate very quickly, and this is another problem. Large organisations communicate very slowly, whether that large organisation is called Greenpeace or ExxonMobil. The difficulties of communication internally should not be forgotten about. And when you're Goliath versus Goliath, when you're Apple versus Google versus Microsoft versus Facebook, you're going to sooner or later get killed if you get in the middle of it. And this was another story, another learning for a big American PR firm. If you get in the middle of a battle of clients and corporates, then you're certainly not immune to being collateral damage. Starting to conclude, there's one problem I've not mentioned yet, and this comes back to your job aspirations. There's a problem of revolving doors. The people that criticise the lobbying world worry about senior officials and politicians. When they leave office and they leave their jobs, they get recruited by public affairs firms or by corporations or by NGOs. Burson Marsteller employs a former Deputy Secretary General of the European Parliament, a former Director General of the European Commission, a former journalist for the Financial Times and senior policy researcher for the EPC, European Policy Centre. So a lot of senior people. And this is usually referred to as revolving doors. You go out through one door and in through another. The example I've given you on the screen is a really good example of the other side of this problem. And this is your problem, everyone in this room. This is a letter to me this week from a stagiaire in DG Competition of the European Commission. Dear Mr. Earnshaw, my name is blanked out. I write to you as a spokesperson for the European Commission DG Competition trainees. As you most certainly know, trainees in DG Comp are truly enthusiastic about working in competition, and some of us would definitely consider staying here in Brussels, either for a traineeship or a job. As lobbying in Brussels is a growing market, and considering the experience we have, we believe your firm and your work is of interest to our fellow trainees. That potentially is a newspaper headline. European Commission DG Competition trainee seek jobs in Burson Marsteller. Or in fact, they've obviously sent the letter to other companies because there's a typo, and he mentions APCO, which is a competitor, in the letter. So he forgot to change the letter before he sent it to me. But this is really, really dangerous because this is open to incredible criticism by the corporate accountability campaigner. You see DG Competition. These are the people that fine Microsoft €1 billion, or the people that are investigating Google. Writing to Burson Marsteller, biggest lobbying company in Brussels, clearly looking for jobs and stages and traineeships, I use it as an example of the revolving door because it's a very different kind of the revolving door from the senior official who wants a job at the end of the career. This is at the beginning of the career. And I find it interesting, it worries me, and I will warn these stagiaires about the position that they're putting themselves into. Because in today's world, that easily becomes a headline. And I think they should be aware of that, and any of you should be aware of that. Finally, to conclude, why is the lobby powerful? And those of you at the beginning who put your hand up and were sceptical about lobbying and lobbyists, you all think, presumably, that the lobby is powerful. Why is it powerful? Is it numbers? Is it because there are 15,000 corporate lobbyists? As I said at the beginning, I think it's very easy to find, for any issue, a countervailing power today. It's not about there being 100 GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, Merck lobbyists versus one Médecins Sans Frontières lobbyist at all. In terms of numbers, there's probably as many NGO lobbyists versus corporate lobbyists. But remember the other thing, remember the trust thing. The difference between Médecins Sans Frontières and GlaxoSmithKline is that Médecins Sans Frontières and Oxfam are trusted. People believe what they say. If you work for GlaxoSmithKline, you're almost by definition not going to tell the truth, Whereas in the case of Médecins Sans Frontières, of course they tell the truth all the time. So they're trusted. So it's not about numbers. There's always an important countervailing power, or at least usually there is. Is it about skill? I don't think there is, because most public interest organisations have extremely skillful advocates today. And not only are they skillful, but usually they can move a hell of a lot quicker than the big organisations that they're campaigning against. And they can also be more brutal in the advertising and the messaging that they use. They can be blunter than the carefully crafted messages of the corporate world. So it's not about skill. I think you find the commitment and the skill across the board. Is it about resources? Well, I told the story of somebody that left a lobbying company and set up their own company and took clients with them. Anyone can be a lobbyist in the 21st century. All you need is an email address, frankly. I mean, 10 years ago, you used to need a fax machine. Now all you need is an email, and anyone can be a lobbyist. So I really don't believe it's about the resources that makes the lobby powerful. Is it because you're based in Brussels? Is it because you've got an office on Place Luxembourg or an office next to the Parliament? I think anyone today can influence European institutions from anywhere they are. Communications are globalised. It's about sending emails. It's not about necessarily being in the same city. There are many examples today of very big legislative issues that have pitted, for example, the information and telecommunications companies against the open source people, Microsoft versus Linux, open source software. And it was the open source people, the little guys, that won against the big companies. So being in Brussels, being powerful in Brussels, having resources in Brussels, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win. Is it about special access? Again, really, everyone's got access today. Anybody that wants to access politicians and officials in the European institutions can gain that access. It's really not difficult. So, on to the conclusion. I think there is one of the problems I see a lot is what I call acquiescent and naive officials and politicians. People who think that they can't resist undue influence. People who think that they can't confront lobbyists. People who are naive and myopic about lobbying. This worries me. I personally would train all MEPs, all their staff, and all Commission officials about the lobby. They need to know what the lobby is after. And they need to have the ability to take from it what they want and to reject the rest. Mike and I knew a leading female British politician called Barbara Castle, who, when she was elected to the European Parliament in the late 70s, all that time ago, and started getting lobbied here in Brussels, she used to say, you know, I always meet lobbyists, I always go for dinner with them, I always go for lunch with them, and I bite their arm off. And that's exactly the right approach. You know, politicians and officials shouldn't be afraid of the lobby. They should use the lobby as either in a political way to get them to influence other politicians and officials, or to get information from them. The best way of controlling the lobby is for the politicians to do it themselves. And it was 20 odd years ago that I wrote that lobbying is controlled by the ability of members of the European Parliament to resist influence. But they have to do it themselves. Secondly, I think parliamentarians and officials frequently lack the political and the personal confidence to confront and challenge the lobbyists themselves. They're too acquiescent. They say yes, 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 rather than confronting what they're being told, rather than challenging what they're being told. The lobby is trying to get their message across. The role of the politician in that situation is to argue, not to agree, necessarily. I worry far more about renationalising European Union politics than about the threat of the lobby. The power of individual member states in the European institutions and the obsession of people with what their own little country or their own little region wants is far more worrying to me than the power of either the corporate or the NGO lobby. And finally, and this is the real nux of the problem, the key to the power of the lobby is the absence of a manifesto, the absence of a programme of government. If you've got a vacuum, she that speaks with the loudest voice is going to have the greatest impact. If you had a programme of government for the European Commission with a mandate, a manifesto, as you usually have in a national environment, that's the greatest threat to the lobby. So long as there is not an identifiable programme of government, the lobby is going to be powerful, and the lobby is going to be the winning side is going to be the one with the loudest voice. And that's what happens when you don't have democratic parliamentary politics.
Thank you very much.